What if I told you that Adolf Hitler didn't die in 1945? What if the supposed suicide in the bunker was just a staged act, while the real man behind the bloodiest war in history escaped and lived quietly in another part of the world? Secret records, forbidden photographs, and silent agreements between world powers all point to a fate no one dares to admit. Because maybe the greatest villain in human history was never actually caught. The bunker was swallowed in silence. Outside, Berlin was crumbling, the distant sound of Russian bombs echoing like doomsday drums. In the dark underground of the Chancellery, the world believed Adolf Hitler was preparing for his final act. But what few knew, and even fewer dared to imagine, was that the script of history had already been carefully rewritten, cigarette smoke mixed with the metallic scent of fear. Officially, Hitler was there with Eva Braun at his side, ready to seal his fate with a cyanide capsule and a single gunshot. But no camera, no credible witness, no clear record of the final scene was ever presented to the world. The few who claimed to have been there told conflicting stories. Some diverged in the details, others in the essentials. And then came the burning. Charred, unrecognizable bodies hurriedly thrown into a crater in the garden. No forensic analysis. No independent verification, just a story, written in haste and under political pressure. While the world celebrated the fall of the Third Reich, far from the spotlight behind the scenes of history, something darker began to unfold. Documents were sealed, Soviet reports were altered, and what was supposed to be an unquestionable truth began to crack, because something didn't add up. Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, stated privately and unequivocally in conferences, "Hitler is not dead." His generals secretly investigated another possibility. They knew the body presented as Hitler's had never been conclusively identified. No dental records, no fingerprints, no DNA. And that's when the question no one wanted to ask, and even fewer dared to answer, was born. What if Hitler didn't die that day? Maybe the greatest lie of the 20th century wasn't about what Hitler did, but about how, or rather, if he truly died. The chaos of the post-war era served as the perfect cover for an unthinkable escape. While Europe struggled to rebuild itself from the ruins of World War II, a covert network quietly took shape. Discreet, efficient, and driven by blind loyalty. Its name, Odessa, a secret organization created to ensure the survival of high-ranking Nazi officers. And at the top of its priority list was none other than Adolf Hitler. Classified reports, which would only come to light decades later, revealed suspicious movements of Nazi submarines departing from Norway toward the South Atlantic. One of them, U-977, vanished from radar for over 2 months before resurfacing off the coast of Argentina in 1945. Officially, it carried desperate sailors seeking refuge, but unofficially, and some claim its most precious cargo, was never listed. Not far from there, in the icy shadows of Patagonia, a mansion began construction during the final months of the war. German architecture, total isolation, constant presence of armed guards, and strange activity that didn't match the calm routine of the region. Locals started whispering about an important man living there, someone who spoke little but demanded absolute respect. And then, the accounts began to surface. In a remote village in the Andes, an elderly woman described in a 1970s interview the day a gray-haired man with a familiar mustache and a German accent walked into her shop. He seemed to avoid eye contact, always paid in cash, never said his name. But she remembered his eyes. Eyes that looked like they had seen more than they should. The theory was too outrageous to be taken seriously, and for that very reason, perfect to be hidden in plain sight. American intelligence knew, the KGB suspected, and Argentina protected. Entry records, fake identities, property purchases under false names, all carefully buried by a network of allies who had much to lose if the truth ever surfaced. Meanwhile, the whole world kept believing the story of the bunker suicide. But what few realized was that, on the other side of the ocean, in cold and quiet lands, the most hated man in modern history may have been living out his final years, free. The night was calm in the province of Rio Negro, Argentina. The wind sliced through the mountains like invisible blades, and the residents of the small town of Bariloche had long grown used to the strange stories that surrounded the forest. An elderly man with a rigid posture and wary eyes was rarely seen and never approached. His real name was a secret, and for those who dared to ask too many questions, only silence remained. The location was perfect. A remote region where former Nazi sympathizers had settled with the help of forged passports and logistical support from influential political figures. There, among glacial lakes and centuries-old pine trees, a quiet German enclave grew, far from the eyes of international justice, a true haven for exiles. It was in this setting that the first concrete pieces of evidence emerged, declassified CIA documents revealing investigations into a man known as the Old German, described as enigmatic, reserved, and strikingly similar to Adolf Hitler. Internal reports suggested the Nazi leader had not only escaped Germany, but had also established a new identity and a quiet lifestyle in the Southern Hemisphere. A photograph, dated 1954, showed an elderly man with sharp features, nearly identical to those of the Führer. The image was analyzed by experts decades later. The result, over 93% facial compatibility. This wasn't just a resemblance. It was as if time had simply extended Hitler's life beyond the pages of official history. The question was inevitable. If he was truly alive and hiding there, as so many seemed to believe, who else knew? Local newspapers, fake medical records, suppressed testimonies, everything pointed to a coordinated effort of protection. But the motive remained unclear. Was it merely ideological loyalty? Or was there something more? A silent agreement between powers? A trade of information, perhaps? The world had stopped looking. And meanwhile, he, the most feared man in modern history, walked freely among ancient trees, feeding pigeons and watching as the world slowly forgot. In the cold corridors of the CIA and the dusty archives of the KGB, the name Adolf Hitler never truly disappeared. Discreetly, yes, but with enough frequency to raise suspicion. Intelligence agents, embedded throughout Latin America during the 1950s and 60s, sent reports describing something unsettling: the constant presence of former Nazi officers in remote regions of Argentina, Paraguay, and Chile. And more than that, clandestine meetings, secret gatherings, and a silent network that still operated with military precision. The United States officially denied any involvement, but documents later released under the Freedom of Information Act told a different story. The CIA knew. American eyes were watching Hitler, and still no action was taken. Why? The answer might lie in the shadowy backdrop of the Cold War. In that new bipolar world where communism and capitalism waged a silent war for global dominance, former enemies became, quite curiously, useful. Nazi scientists were recruited through Operation Paperclip. Information on warfare tactics, population control, and human experimentation was considered valuable intelligence. And in that context, chasing down an old exile may not have been a priority, especially if that old man still held secrets the victors of the war found useful. The USSR, on the other hand, used Hitler's disappearance as a political weapon. Stalin accused the West of a cover-up. The Soviets, despite claiming to have discovered the body, never released conclusive evidence. No public photos, no reliable death certificate. And when the skull fragment supposedly belonging to Hitler was tested in 2009, the truth shocked the world. The DNA belonged to a woman. The entire narrative collapsed. The performance the world applauded as the end of evil may have been nothing more than a carefully staged act, and the silence of the world powers, complicit, strategic, and convenient, became just as deafening as the bombs that once echoed through Berlin. It was 1970. A French journalist obsessed with conspiracies and war fugitives was traveling through Patagonia in search of stories buried by time. His name was Jean Moreau, and what he captured with his old camera would later become one of the most controversial images of the 20th century. The photograph showed an elderly man sitting in the shade of a rustic porch. His partially lit face revealed familiar features: a broad forehead, a thin and straight nose, a short, neatly trimmed mustache. His eyes, half squinting against the sun, stared into the distance, or perhaps into the past. At first, the image was dismissed as a mere coincidence, just some old man lost in the southern tip of the world. But when Moreau quietly published it in an alternative newspaper in Paris, a facial recognition expert happened to read the piece, and the scandal erupted. The digital analysis, conducted years later using modern technology, was shocking. The mysterious man's face had a 93.7% match with that of Adolf Hitler. More than just a resemblance, it was nearly a visual confirmation. But there was one problem. The man in the photo appeared to be around 80 years old. And if it truly was Hitler, it meant he had been alive. 25 years after his supposed death, the photo was quickly suppressed. The newspaper that published it faced sabotage and lost its funding. Jean Moreau died mysteriously in a car accident 2 months later. His camera was destroyed. Only one copy of the negative survived, hidden for decades by a colleague who, years later, decided to share it with an Argentine historian. The image still circulates online, always sparking heated debate. To some, it's a hoax. To others, it's definitive proof that the truth has always been right in front of us, simply ignored. But the question lingers like a disturbing whisper in the minds of those who dare to dig deeper. If that photo wasn't of Hitler, why did so many die to silence it? The story, as it's been told to us, has always had gaps, convenient holes, vague timelines, conflicting testimonies, but what once seemed like the simple confusion of war now feels like something far more deliberate. A controlled narrative. In the 1990s, formally classified documents began to surface, and with them, an unsettling pattern. British intelligence reports, American telegrams, and even Mossad dossiers contained indirect references to an important man living under protection in South America. False names, reconstructed identities, silenced witnesses, always the same shadow: Hitler. But perhaps the most disturbing detail isn't that he survived, but why he was allowed to live. A German historian, Reinhard Keller, dedicated more than 30 years to uncovering the truth. He crossed borders, interviewed dozens of people, sifted through secret archives. In his final interview before mysteriously disappearing during a trip to Chile, he left behind a phrase that echoes like a prophecy. The truth about Hitler was never buried. It was carefully bricked into the foundation of the world rebuilt after the war. After all, accepting that he escaped would mean admitting that the victors of the war allowed it, or worse, helped make it happen. It would mean rewriting not just the death of one man, but the entire post-war order, the reconstruction, the division of Germany, the formation of the United Nations, all built on a sacred lie. The impact would be catastrophic, and that's why perhaps the truth remains buried, not because it wasn't discovered, but because no one is ready to face it. The final question is no longer where is Hitler, but rather what else was buried with him. What if the greatest monster in modern history was never punished? What if he died far from the Nuremberg trials, no handcuffs on his wrists, no eye contact with his victims, but instead lying in a bed, to the sound of the Patagonian wind, surrounded by the complicit silence of those who should have hunted him? The idea is infuriating, unacceptable, but maybe that's exactly why it was so well hidden. The official story brings comfort. It offers closure, a fair ending, a tragic suicide in a dark bunker, a burned body, a war ended, a new world rising from the ashes. But what do we do when we realize the ending wasn't an end, but a silent agreement, a power pact made over the heads of the victims? Hitler's image has always served as the symbol of absolute evil, a necessary villain to justify actions, wars, systems of control. But a living or hidden symbol is far more dangerous than a martyr burned in Berlin's basement. Maybe he was allowed to live because his continued existence served greater interests. Maybe the world needed an invisible enemy to justify surveillance, repression, and reconstruction. And in this geopolitical chess game, Hitler wasn't the end, but the beginning of something much larger and darker. Hitler's true fate, in the end, isn't just about where he died. It's about what he set in motion, what was permitted, and everything we continue to allow in the name of order. Because when the truth becomes too dangerous to reveal, that's when it turns into legend.